webinar series. Today marks the start of our second webinar focused on underrepresented populations in clinical trials, and we're so glad that you are able to join us today. I would like to ask for the next slide, please. And before we begin, we would like to go through the participant guide, which can be found on the next slide. Looking at what we will do today for logistics, please note that the conference is in English. Interpretation is available in French. You will need to click on the Zoom icon to enable this French interpretation. We will have an opportunity in the second half of the webinar for questions and answers. So we do ask that you take that opportunity to use the Q&As. And we will include any resources that have been suggested by the speakers today. Those will be announced during the webinar, so please look out for that. We will record today's session, and all the speakers' presentations and videos will be available on the Africa Regulatory Conference website. So we're very excited to have this second webinar focused on underrepresented populations in clinical trials. We have an excellent lineup of speakers. And to kick off today's discussion, I'd like to introduce Carrie Cullinan from Health Policy Watch, who will be our moderator today. Over to you, Carrie.
Thanks so much, Janice, and welcome everybody. I'm joining from Cape Town, where we are still waiting for summer, but luckily we are not waiting. Nobody else is waiting. I see lots of people are joining us, so welcome. This first session, well, the whole webinar is going to try and change people's mindset from thinking that people need to be protected from research and trying to show how research can actually protect people and why it's really important that research includes underrepresented populations. This first session is going to look at research ethics, because when we're dealing with underrepresented populations, we're talking about people like pregnant women, babies, very, very sensitive populations. So ethics is extremely important. And I'm very delighted to say that we have two people who are extremely good at representing the ethical community. We have Jacqueline Kitulu, who's the incoming president of the World Medical Association. And as many of you will probably know, the World Medical Association developed the Helsinki Declaration, which sets out ethical principles for research on people. And we have Mercury Shitindo, who's the chair and executive director of the Africa Bioethics Network. And she's actually the founder of the network as well. So I'm going to ask Jacqueline first and then Mercury if they can just introduce themselves briefly and their organization and tell us why it's important that African clinical trials include underrepresented populations. So Jacqueline, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Carrie. I'm delighted to be here. Indeed, as you've introduced me, I'm Dr. Jacqueline Kitulu. I'm the president-elect of the World Medical Association. The WMA represents physicians globally and champions medical ethics, professional standards, and patient rights. And in the context of clinical research, our focus is to ensure trials respect human dignity, are scientifically sound, and deliver benefits equitably. So the WMA works with national medical associations. It works with research institutions, regulators, and community partners to embed medical ethics into every stage of research. So you asked why include underrepresented populations and ethical risks of that continued exclusion. So basically, from an ethics perspective, the imperative is justice and beneficence. And including underrepresented groups, that's women, including the pregnant ones, older adults, children, people with disabilities, indigenous and marginalized populations, and those in conflict settings, ensures that benefits and burdens of research are fairly distributed, and that safety and efficacy data are relevant to those who use the interventions. I think these excluded groups and excluding these groups really generates several ethical harms. It risks clinical decisions built on non-generalizable data. And I think that's a big thing we've been talking about in Africa because a lot of the research has been done elsewhere. But it also perpetuates health inequities. It invites exploitation, really research that benefits others, but not the excluded communities. And it violates respect for persons when vulnerable groups are defaulted out rather than meaningfully engaged. So practical exclusion can cause harm when interventions are later rolled out without safety or dosage data for larger segments of the population who are really the excluded or underrepresented groups. Yeah, thank you.
I think that's a great intro. Thank you. And Mercury, over to you. If you can also give a similar introduction to your organization yourself and also address that question, why we need in Africa to include underrepresented populations.
Thank you, Kerry, and greetings to all colleagues. My name is Mercury Shitindo. I serve as the Executive Director of the Africa Bioethics Network, which connects and has membership across 42 countries in Africa. I'm also the co-editor-in-chief for Africa Journal of Bioethics. And our core mission is to strengthen ethical research ecosystems across Africa, and we do this in several different ways through training, mentorship, applied research, and development of frameworks that actually address some of the realities from our own context. This is whether it's supporting ethical committees, mentoring early career researchers and bioethicists, and conducting that research itself and engaging directly with communities and policymakers. And that being said, we have to also say that our mission also closely aligns with the theme of this conference, where we are actually shifting. It's not really a shift per se, but we are not just protecting people from research, but we are also working on ways to protect people through research. And this particular shift requires not only including underrepresented populations in trials, but also ensuring that if we have ethical frameworks, our regulatory systems and community voices are at the center of how research is designed, conducted, and shared, as I'm sure we will discuss later. This shift is essential because when we do exclude from trials the underrepresented populations, it's no longer about just equity, it's also about epistemic justice. When research excludes certain populations, we are not able to get, we miss evidence that would have come from them that should have guided the medicine in the first place. And then we end up creating treatments that are optimized for narrow groups. So typically, healthy adults, and apply them universally. So the consequences here are very serious. For example, in Africa, we've long, for many years, pregnant women have been excluded from anti-malarial trials for years. Even though malaria is a leading cause of maternal mortality, the result was having dosing guidelines that weren't optimized for pregnancy, turning the so-called protection into actual harm. So we see the same risks with children, older people, those with comorbidities, being excluded. So decisions about their care are made without evidence from their realities. And the ethical risk here is, of continuing down this path is that we perpetuate the iniquities and deny evidence-based options to those who carry the greatest burden. So inclusion is just, we have to look at it as also justice. It is also better science, and it's the better way forward. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So I mentioned the Helsinki Declaration. Is it still relevant for advancing inclusivity in an African context? And if it's not, are there other guidances that you also use to focus on the continent?
So,
Jacqueline, Sorry.
I just imagined it was for me, seeing as the World Medical Association is the author of the Declaration of Helsinki. And indeed, it is as relevant as it was 60 years ago. So actually, the Declaration of Helsinki was 60 years last year in 2024. So there were some revisions made in the last year and actually launched at the General Assembly. So this Declaration of Helsinki remains the cornerstone for human subjects research. Its principles of respect, informed consent, independent review, and social value are directly applicable to inclusion. However, advancing inclusivity in Africa requires contextual elaboration. Operational guidance on consent when literacy or power imbalances are present. That's a really big issue. You need clearer ethical defensible pathways for including pregnant people and other historically excluded groups, guidance on community consent and engagement where collective decision-making is culturally important, and that's a big one for us in Africa, and stronger language on post-trial obligations and benefit sharing. So we also need practical, regionally adapted guidance on data, sovereignty, secondary use, and equitable collaboration between external sponsors and local investigators. So indeed, it is relevant, but there are aspects that I think from the African context, and those are the ones that I've brought out, that need adaptation, need more elaboration, so that it is then useful for us in a context that is culturally acceptable in Africa as well. Yeah.
Okay, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I do agree because they establish what needs to happen, the access. But then when it comes to operationalization, then we have to navigate community consent structures. That's some of the work we are actively doing right now, with global tools, guidelines. We are trying to see how we can be able to actually complement and be able
operationalize.
Yes, the word is refusing. So because one of the things that we actually face is that many of these tools were developed without our contribution, meaning that even when it comes to adapting, it is expensive for us to adapt. It becomes work by itself to adapt to whatever setup. So then we still need tools that will be adaptable, but how do we ensure that they are in a state that it becomes easy for us to adapt? So one of the things that we are actively doing is that we are trying to see how we can complement these international standards and how we can implement them effectively, filling gaps that they don't address. So that we have guidelines that actually also directly speak to our realities. I hope that.
Yeah, that makes sense. I remember a few years back covering a story about how African women who are on antiretrovirals were starting to have side effects, which were never noted in the clinical trials. But then they realized that the clinical trials had only been done on white men in America. And so they would, the data was completely inappropriate. And certainly in my country, South Africa, they had to change the first line treatment of the ARVs because it just didn't suit African women. So I really understand, adaptation for Africa, for the continent is extremely important. So my fourth question is then, how are organizations in Africa engaging with the research and ethics communities and regulators and even communities themselves to strengthen this inclusivity? And can you share any lessons? So I think I'm going to start with you, Mercury, on this one.
Thank you. Thank you. We are actually actively building capacities across. We are taking comprehensive ecosystem-wide approach through multiple fronts. So we do have country representatives. We currently have 23 country representatives. And one of the things that we do is build capacities. When you build capacities, you are ensuring that people know what they need to do. So that even if they do get some of the guidelines, if they are conducting research, if they are part of the ethics committees, they know how they should apply some of these principles. They will know what is applicable to them. So it is different forms. We have the frameworks. How do you use the frameworks? When we do our trainings, we ensure there's an applied component. And we do have leadership programs where we are also mentoring early career researchers so that we are moving people from learning to leading. We do also provide a platform for sharing knowledge, sharing ideas, what worked, what didn't work. It could have happened in one country. How can that be helpful in another country? And of course, we are also trying to actively generate evidence and tools that we needed to adapt global standards like the Declaration of Helsinki. And apart from that, we are actively as well seeing how we can be able to work together through partnerships and integrating our own, just some of the African principles. So some of the lessons that I can be able to pinpoint is that co-design is essential. When you work with communities, they shape how research is at the design stage, because that's what normally happens. We include them generally afterwards when it becomes so difficult. Even ethics, it's included when you need to submit for ethical approval, but we need to be able to shape research at the design stage so that trials are both more ethical and more feasible. This engagement, like for example, with traditional healers has shown that you will have better reception. When you go to some communities, there's sustained investment in that. It becomes easy for you to be able to recruit because you establish trust. So the continuous mentorship training and networking helps in building some of these trusts. And then of course ethics cannot sit in isolation. So inclusion becomes real only when we have researchers, committees for ethics committees, and communities with regulators are resourced and connected within one system. It doesn't have to be ABN. It can be many different ways, but we are speaking the same language. So if we want underrepresented populations to participate fairly, we must also strengthen the whole ecosystem so that it is also including them at the inception, not just the individual pieces of it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mercury. And Jacqueline, what do you think about this?
So I indeed agree with you, Mercury, at all, all the levels, indeed, even the practical examples you've given. And I think across Africa, we are also seeing a combination of strategies really coming up. Strengthening national ethics committees and institutional review boards is one of the ways that's going around that. Creating community advisory boards that participate in protocol design, which I think Mercury has spoken to in a great way. Training investigators in culturally competent consent and inclusive recruitment. Mm-hmm. Harmonizing regulatory pathways to allow multi-site inclusive trials, and even piloting decentralized pragmatic trial models to reach remote or conflict have come. Have you lost me?
Just for a moment. You came back.
Sorry. All right. Might be a media glitch somewhere. So there's some lessons, I think, which have come out so far. And from some of the lessons that early and continuous community engagement is non-negotiable. They have to be part and parcel of the design. We need to work on flexible protocol designs. And here we're giving examples of adaptive eligibility and pragmatic endpoints. Those are some of the things to think about. Improving inclusion, trust building, which we can only build through transparency about risks, about benefits and post-trial plans, and capacity building of local investigators and ethic committees is essential so that inclusion is led locally rather than imposed. So a lot of this is just trying to see how do we become more inclusive, but also building on the community strategies, and those we realize then actually become non-negotiable items that will enhance research in Africa. Yeah.
Do you think there are any shifts that are needed to sustain progress on inclusivity in Africa's clinical research ecosystem? You've mentioned, Jacqueline, actually a few, flexible design, etc. But Mercu, can you address that to start with? What do you think the shift should be, if any?
To add on to what Jacqueline has well laid for us, is that inclusion has to be designed from the start, as I had said, because if this is, we are not talking about just the design, we are talking about the recruitment strategies and also budgeting, because what happens is that community engagement is also not cheap. So this has to be factored in at the inception, because inclusive trials require longer timelines, community and the translation, culturally relevant materials. These are not optional, extras are essential. So we have to see how funding has to cover the real cost of inclusion, so that you're not really trying to see how it fits, but it is there from the beginning. So we are moving from project-based grants to institutional investment, in ethics committees, training systems that Jacqueline has mentioned, local journals. So we are ensuring it's sustainable and not just fragile. So this is what we normally talk about when we talk about ethics by design, so that everything is part of it. It's not, you're not ticking somewhere that you've done this, you've not done that. So frameworks also have to be locally adapted, and how, their guidance is essential, but they don't tell us how to implement inclusion in settings with limited infrastructure that have oral traditions or fragmented health systems, which is a lot of our realities. Through some of the initiatives where we see, including what we are also doing, we see people coming up with, those like annexes or tools that are there to help understand maybe what the guidelines are talking about. We are also mapping and just developing that guidance that complements, not rejecting global standards. And then more trials have to also have African PIs, so that we also deal with the element of data ownership, where we are having researchers from Africa also shaping this global policy, and doesn't have to be Africa only. From all setups, we are shaping global policy, not just implementing, because most of the time that's what we do. A protocol will come in, we need somebody with competency and all that, you get, everything, and then we implement. So the programs that we are having, they show that we have already the expertise. Then we have to move from not just capacity buildings, which is very good, but then it also implies that there is deficiency. So we move towards capacity building, capacity strengthening, and partnership, so that we are focused also on scaling what is already there. Because we have to, for us to sustain inclusion, we also have to work together, design systems together that reflects our own realities. Thank you.
Thanks, Mercu. Jacqueline, I know that you're going up to the global, but you've got loads and loads of experience in Kenya, in particular in private and public health, and across a whole range of organizations. So can you also tell us if you think that there need to be shifts to improve and sustain the progress on inclusivity?
Absolutely, and Mercury, indeed, I totally agree with you, and especially as you started with the funding issue, that funders have to earmark resources specifically for inclusive recruitment. There's funding for everything, but it has to be specific for inclusive recruitment. You've already spoken to the community engagement and local capacity strengthening. but also regulators and ethics bodies must adopt guidance that supports safe inclusion. I think because most of what they adopt is more of exclusion, like a blanket exclusion. Now it's that shift to a point of what is the guidance for safe inclusion. And then harmonizing across borders. We may be talking in our own various countries, but research sometimes occurs across several countries. How do we harmonize that across borders? Then academic and sponsor incentives should reward equitable partnerships. So, we are talking about carrots in some places and sticks, but let's reward equitable partnerships. Local leadership and authorship. Indeed, we need more African PIs. They can't always be the ones whose names come at the end of, of the authors in there. They need to be the PIs. And then we need, another area is robust metrics and accountability, so that we are tracking things like who is enrolled, who benefits, is the data disaggregated, and what has been used to guide that policy. So we need really, really robust metrics to track all these things, because it's one thing to say these are shifts needed, but are we tracking what those shifts and what is the end product? And finally, building sustainable community research partnerships, so that inclusion becomes more of a routine practice rather than check the box, which many times you're doing, but it becomes part and parcel. And I think success will be when you no longer need to talk about inclusion to the point when it's just, an everyday affair. Yeah, thank you.
So there is a question in the Q&A which kind of links to the next question. So, the question is, are there specific guidelines just for Africa, for available for community engagement for the African continent? So maybe if you can wrap a response to that into the next question, which is the lessons that we have learned in Africa and our approaches to inclusivity. You've covered so many of these. Can we take them to other regions who also have indigenous populations, etc., who also have under-resourced populations, and could we offer these lessons to assist in other regions, instead of always the assumption that Africa needs help, but that we can also help other regions? Who would like to start? Becky, can you start us on that one?
Yeah. Well, one of the key things you've already mentioned, community engagement. For us, community engagement is a default. You can't do anything without it. So you can't run ethical clinical trials without community engagement at every stage. Even if it's not funded or what, just the way the setup is will force you to do that. And this is what is practiced, like some of the studies that you've spoken about, like for HIV and then anti-malarial, would only succeed when communities, and those traditional leaders are part of the process. And this shows this is already an approach that we can see globally, people now trying to ensure it's part of the design. So that is a learning lesson. That is something which you can be able to share with. And then when we talk about intersectionality, this is a lived reality, because most people, when we talk about underrepresentation, where you're talking about like a pregnant woman or the elderly, for us, vulnerability already is layered. You might be a pregnant woman who is living in a rural area. There might be a layer of poverty, comorbidities, gender norms, climate impacts. All of these are intersections. And we've had to design trials that navigate this particular complexity, which gives us also as well a default lens on intersectionality, that other regions are just beginning to grapple with. So that is something which we can be able to share. And then when we talk about resource limitations, yes, we talk about resource constraints, and it's normally looked at as negatively. But then how I think about it is that sometimes necessity is the mother. Sometimes it makes you become innovative. So we are forced to come up with practical solutions, which somebody else might look at it as workarounds, but then they create efficiency, and then we are able to navigate with maybe a small budget and come up with a model that could help others rethink how inclusion can still be achieved, especially now with the global funding cuts all over. So these are models with global relevance, and we are just showing that inclusion is possible when we work together, genuinely. We are not looking at each other as pieces of a puzzle, this is partner A, but we're looking at each other as communities. That community coming together is already a way in which we can be able to provide us lessons. And that's why we are actively trying to see how we can be able to come up with guidelines that document some of the lessons, the values, the cultural norms that we can use we have a project like that, it's called Tebra, that can be used to be able to also inform other settings of how they can also do some of these things. Thank you.
Thanks. So Jacqueline, you are going to step up into a global position, and you will be the perfect person to take some of these lessons that Mercury is offering. What do you think that it's realistic that we can offer guidance to other regions?
Absolutely. In fact, I think Africa can offer pragmatic leadership, not just sharing. We can be the, leadership. Let's be the guide in that. And indeed, the things that Mercury has spoken to, that we're sharing our successful models, such as community advisory boards that shape protocols, that the decentralized trials using mobile health, our south-to-south investigator networks, and negotiation of equitable collaboration terms. So there are many areas, and I think other regions can learn from ours in terms of the emphasis on community trust, locally led capacity building, and practical adaptations that preserve ethics while widening participation. So that, Africa's experience with the rapid large-scale vaccination and treatment trials have shown that, yes, we can recruit diverse populations ethically and efficiently. So I am looking at, as I step into that global role, that Africa can offer pragmatic leadership in this area.
Excellent, thank you. There are a couple of questions in the chat. If you, the one is, one of the challenges in Africa for ethics committees is how these committees are paid. What financial incentives are you working on to attract and retain experienced talents with the right expertise in ethics committees? So, I mean, that goes straight to the lack of resources and so on. Do these ethics committees get paid? And if so, how do you work on the remuneration? Either of you want to try and take that question?
Mercury, I think since you're running it in a network with that, maybe you take that one.
I will be honest. It is a difficult area. It is one of the things we did have a discussion in last week. There was a meeting. Africa CDC did convene to see how they can be able to have a continental, bioethics committee. And one of the things that came up was the remuneration. How do you keep motivated? Because you see, you can't really pay. And we were lucky because we did have we were a visitor or a guest speaker from Brazil who came to talk to us on how they do it and how we can be able to learn from that. So I am going to share what we learned and what we want to try and see how we can be able to share with other people as a way of seeing sustainable. That if you are dealing with faculty or people who are part of the ethics committees, being able to embed the work they do as ethics committee reviewers as an act of service, so that they do receive their salary, but as part of the hours they need to give back. Like, let's say, if you're an early career researcher, if you're a postdoctoral fellow or a PhD student, one of the things that you will
Mercury paused.
It adds to your, it adds
Yeah.
to, it adds to, it adds to your career. Like you need to have additional payment because ethics committees are not funded unless you get external funding. And the money we charge is not for payment. We can't afford to pay ethical committee reviewers. So this is normally a volunteer service, and what is normally given would just be the communication allowance, but it's not paid. So, but then this, if we are able to include this, you know, as part of a role somebody has, so that our universities, our academia already embed this within their systems, then we can be able to already support, we can already be able to support the ethics committee, so that for a person to join the ethics committee, they know that this is part of their role. They will receive their salary. Their work already provides an element of hours that they can be able to allocate, so they are not giving extra time to this. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, that does help. There's another question here, which I think is really also really relevant. The regulators can play a pivotal role in ensuring that underrepresented populations are included in trials. What programs are in place to build their capacity? Jacqueline, do you want to try and tackle that, or is this also a Mercury question?
So probably more of a Mercury question, but I know that in the context of inclusivity, they are pivotal in that area, because as regulators, they're able to clamp down on any research going on. So if they're not, and if they're not setting the policies and guidelines for safe inclusivity rather than, you know, blanket exclusion, because actually most regulators work on exclusion. It's easier to work on that, but how to work then on the safe inclusion and working through those policies to ensure that aligns. So yes, so now I hand over to Mercury to give the practical example.
Thank you. We have trainings actually that, and we do that have the applied component. Like today when we are finished here, some people can be able to come and join a public webinar we are hosting for clinical ethics, which speaks to this topic. So yes, we do have several trainings, and as I said, our trainings are not specific to ethics committees only, but we are looking at the whole ecosystems. We have the researchers, we have the policymakers, and in the policymakers, we have the inclusion of the regulators, because that's how we look at them. And we also have the community itself. So that's a whole ecosystem. And when you talk about ethics committees, you're talking about the national ethics committees, which would be the body that falls in most places under the ministry. And apart from that, we are currently, this started last year, we are mapping resources within the continent so that we can also identify what are the gaps, the training gaps that we have within the continent, so that if we are having training, what are the areas to focus on? What are the underrepresented areas, countries, and things like that? So we are hoping we can have a guidance document in 2026.
Awesome.
Okay.
I think you both spoke about intersectionality, and we're talking about underrepresented populations, but you might be, you might be pregnant and have a disability, or there might be some overlaps. So how do you deal with how do you incorporate intersectionality into a trial? Maybe just briefly. I'm not sure. Jacqueline, do you want to start
yeah,
that?
so maybe practically you can incorporate it by collecting and analyzing disaggregated data. So, you know, the age, the sex, the gender identity, disability, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status, but also using mixed methods, formative work, to understand intersecting barriers, so that you, in that inclusion of intersectional eligibility and recruitment in your you incorporate that in the strategies of recruitment. And then, of course, training the ethics committees. We keep going back to these committees, but training the ethics committees to assess layered risks, because, sometimes you just focused on one, but to remember that there can be layers of them. And then to co-create protections with representatives of the intersecting groups. So essentially, intersectionality demands that we have a participatory protocol design and flexible safeguards to tailor to lived realities rather than just, the boxes in which we tend to place people. Yeah, thanks.
Excellent. So we're going to need to wrap this beautiful discussion, and we weren't even going to take questions, but they were coming thick and fast in the Q&A, so that's why I took a few. So I'm going to hand over to each of you to just ask if you could just wrap up in a minute what you see as the most important things that you want to impress going forward with including underrepresented populations. So Mercury, I'm handing over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this particular training. I would just say that inclusion in clinical research, it's not charity, it's justice. I know I said it earlier, but I'm just repeating it for emphasis. And exclusion that doesn't just weaken the evidence base, it also harms the very communities that this research is meant to serve. We are already building foundations of inclusive research. So this is not about preparations. We are already taking leadership. It's already leadership in action. And our question here isn't whether Africa will contribute to the future of inclusive ethical research. We are already doing so. The real question is whether global institutions will adapt to what Africa is developing and whether international frameworks will evolve to reflect innovations born here rather than just expecting us to simply implement what has been brought forth.
And Jacqueline, as you step onto your international stage, what message would you like to impress?
So for me, that inclusivity in clinical research is both a moral duty and a scientific necessity. And if we want health interventions that work for everyone, then we must change how we design research, that it reflects real populations and power dynamics. And then we commit to concrete steps, fund community engagement, strengthen local ethics and regulatory capacity, require disaggregated data, and guarantee post-trial benefits so that the science that we produce serves justice as well as health.
Thank you so much. I think that's a perfect place to stop. So thanks again to the two speakers. Excellent background that you have supplied for us, because our next session is going to look straight at projects that are supporting inclusivity. So we're going to move rapidly into the next session. We have 3 projects. The first one is going to look at pediatrics and pregnant women in clinical trials. And here it's 2 speakers from the WHO. I'm going to hand over. The first speaker is going to be Martina Penazzato, who's the lead of the Global Accelerator for Pediatric Formulations Network, known as GAP-F at the WHO. She's going to take the first part, and then following straight on from her is Mariana Widmer, who's a scientist at the Maternal and Perinatal Health Unit of the WHO. So I'm going to hand over to them straight away because we have very limited time and a packed presentation today.
Thank you so much, Kerry, and thank you to the organizers for the opportunity to share our work and our thoughts into this great format. As you noted, I will focus particularly on the pediatric population and hand over to my colleague Mariana to take over on the pregnant and lactating women front. But let me first start perhaps reminding everyone in the next slide how WHO has been put in charge by member states to coordinate and facilitate a recommitment that countries have made in strengthening the clinical trial ecosystem. And since then, in 2022, we have made important steps forward that have resulted in the release of WHO guidance, the first WHO guidance to support countries to strengthen the clinical trial ecosystem and best practices on that, and developed a global action plan that has been released that has an important action number 3, that speaks specifically to the need of underrepresented populations. And this work obviously continues in multiple activities that you will hear in the near future, and that are facilitated through the creation of the GCTF, the Global Clinical Trial Forum Network that has been created at WHO. So as part of this work, in the next slide, we have also moved forward to really capture the underrepresented populations into a standard framework that has been shared with countries to support their action and leadership in strengthening the clinical trial ecosystem. And in the next slide, you see some of the plans that we have for the next few months to really further our policy guidance when it comes to inclusion of underrepresented populations. But to do that, we feel that we do need to start with a scoping review and root causes analysis that also helps us to better define what underrepresented populations are, and also understand better the policy landscape and the gaps that exist, so that we can indeed develop policy guidance and implementation tools that can make a difference and support countries in this exercise. So I'll hone in a little bit more into the work that we have already undertaken for the pediatric population. And so in the next slide, you see a bit of a reminder of some of the key barriers that we have identified with the advice and contribution of many experts that operate in the pediatric clinical trial space. And in here, we have acknowledged that there are many barriers that prevent inclusion of children in clinical trials that are often very barriers that are shared with other parts of the population, but there are barriers that disproportionately affect the pediatric research. And experts that are hands-on in the conduct of clinical trials in this population have flagged how ethics and regulatory frameworks at times are perceived to be not necessarily be supporting the implementation of these trials. And at times, as has been said today, their resources to support adequate engagement or adequate work in this space has not necessarily been directed to the priorities that the global community in the pediatric clinical research space has felt as important. And so obviously all of this results into lack of research capacity that then trickles down into a limited ability to include children in clinical trials. So what we have put forward in the next slide is what is more articulated into a Lancet paper that is part of a Lancet series that was launched earlier this year. And it basically advocates for a more coordinated, transparent process to identify key priorities for this type of research, and enabling factors and activities that can indeed create an environment and an infrastructure that does help the implementation of this type of research, but also contribution to creating and strengthening the capacity that is already on the ground in many regions, in particular in the African region. So in the next slide, you see also how these priorities have been identified already, and we're counting to launch these priorities by the end of the month. So we'll certainly make sure that we disseminate this as widely as possible. But in the next slide, obviously, there is a reminder of those enablers that we think are essential to make this work. As we noted earlier, the importance of targeting funding to the priorities and the activities that can indeed support long-lasting change at the country level, and then working with regulators and ethics frameworks in countries to ensure that those are supportive of a more timely inclusion of children in research. And the knowledge translation component is always a reminder that ultimately the research is conducted to translate that into policy change and change in practice. And so that is always the last step, but a very important one that we should never forget. Thankfully, we do have a platform that when it comes to pediatric medicines, we can rely on. And in the next slide, you see a bit of a reminder of the work. If you can click again. that the GAPF, the Global Accelerator for Pediatric Formulations, has done over the years to bring together a number of key partners and stakeholders in the pediatric medicine space. And that has resulted into an evolving landscape of work that we identify together and we implement together. We have recently launched our updated strategy for the next 5 years at WHA. And in the next slide, you can see a little bit of what our ambition looks like for the next 5 years. And I think these goals do represent a number of key strategic shifts. One, the desire to expand the disease focus far beyond what we had originally considered to really address all the unmet needs across therapeutic areas. Still the intention to continue to foster and enable the important work that our partners undertake to advance key specific priority products. And then lastly, but very, very importantly, the opportunity for us to support countries in strengthening their leadership and ownership in improving the pediatric medicine ecosystem in countries, and with that, their ability to obviously undertake clinical trials. And so in the next slide, you see how we continue to operate across the product life cycle and how clinical research remain a cornerstone of the work that we're trying to enable along two axes where we make sure that stakeholders try to align as much as possible and better coordinate in this space, but also how we can generate specific collaborations that can generate long-lasting change. And when it comes to clinical research, if you look at our strategy, you will find a number of activities that will now be part of the work that we do all together to try to, again, strengthen the ability of regions and countries to support the clinical trial ecosystem that will allow those researchers that are already on the ground to continue to contribute to a future where children have better medicines. And that might entail innovating study design, bringing the community more clearly at the forefront of the study conduct, and then really working with regulators and industry to perhaps review opportunities for us to accelerate clinical study design, implementation, and find regulatory efficiencies where that is possible. Of course, we'll continue to do that in an ecosystem approach, and I think these has been flagged already in the conversation so far. In the next slide, you just see a number of the stakeholders that we will continue to work together. And obviously, for the audience today, I think that the private sector and regulators are really the two essential players in this space. And we are moving forward with a more concrete framework that will allow us to be mutually accountable in our collaboration moving forward. And then with regulators to really trying to explore opportunities for regulatory efficiency, but also for greater chances to utilize regional collaboration, work sharing approaches to really benefit those children that are in need of better medicines. And so in the interest of time, I'll stop there, but I really hope that those that are on the line will reach out to us with any question or any idea to further our collaborative work in this space and really to generate that long-lasting change that we hope to achieve over the next few years. Thank you very much, and over to you, Mariana.
Thank you, Martina.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Mariana Widmer. I'm a scientist in the team of maternal and perinatal health at the World Health Organization. And today I will explain why we believe that inclusive research is essential to maternal health. Next. In 2025, women continue to die during childbirth. The main causes are hemorrhage, indirect causes such as non-communicable diseases and chronic conditions, and hypertension in pregnancy. To reduce maternal mortality, we must address not only pregnancy-related complications, which are the first and third causes of maternal mortality, but also broader health issues that affect women throughout life, such as non-communicable diseases, which is the second cause of maternal mortality. Next. Pregnancy introduces significant physiological changes. For example, the blood volume increases by about 40%, and this affects how medicines are absorbed and processed. Without pregnancy-specific data, safety and effectiveness are unknown. So medicines should be tested in pregnant women to ensure safe treatment. Next. So yet, pregnant women are often excluded from trials. Around 70% of the pregnant women take prescriptions medicines, and most of them are off-label. Therefore, excluding pregnant women from research can actually pose greater risks than including them. Next. If we look at international clinical trials registry, only 4% of the trials registered include pregnant women. 34% actively exclude them, and over half don't specify. For non-communicable diseases, the inclusion rate is even lower. Next. The COVID-19 examples show this clearly. Despite an increase in clinical trials during this period, 75% excluded pregnant women, even though they were at higher risk of COVID-related complications. Next. So why are pregnant women excluded? First, there is a perceived low profitability, and companies tend to invest less in pregnancy-related drug research. Second, there are research capacity challenges. Ethical boards and researchers often lack expertise on pregnancy biology. Third, there is limited autonomy of the women, and pregnant women are often not viewed as active participants in research. Next. So we need a paradigm shift. Pregnant women should be protected through research, not from research. This requires a global commitment to count women, study women, include women, care for women, invest in women. We need quality research to generate the evidence needed for safe and effective care of the women, including when they are pregnant. Next. Driving this global shift demands coordinated action from multiple stakeholders. WHO teams, for example, in malaria, TB, HIV, vaccines, epidemics, and maternal health, as well as external partners such as MMV, Concept Foundation, DNDi, and many others, are already working on this, and this is the very good news. Next. So why am I saying that we need a coordinated action approach? This is because there is a public health need identified. Initiatives to promote the inclusion of pregnant and lactating women exist, but are often fragmented. There is momentum if we consider that several guidance and resolutions produced by WHO, the World Health Assembly, the ICH are already available. And finally, WHO's convening power offers a real opportunity to raise awareness and drive collaboration for better health interventions. Next. So, a concrete example of how WHO is addressing underrepresented groups in clinical trials for pregnancy is the task force for the timely inclusion of pregnant and lactating women in clinical trials that we launched in May this year. This task force serves as a collaborative platform to align approaches and foster cooperation across WHO units in efforts to include pregnant women in clinical trials. The vision of this group is to ensure that by 2030, pregnant and lactating women are included in clinical trials in a timely and ethical manner. So to achieve this, we will create an enabling environment to foster collaboration with international partners. So the task force comprises representatives from diverse WHO departments already, and we are planning to invite external stakeholders in the near future. Next. So the task force has four main pillars. One of the four main pillars is to ensure better and timely inclusion of pregnant and lactating women in clinical trials. This will be achieved by enhancing understanding of current evidence gaps, developing guidance and implementation tools to facilitate the inclusion of pregnant and lactating women, and monitoring their participation at a global level. For your information, we are currently working on an online toolkit that will contain different modules that will provide guidance on what stakeholders have to consider when planning a trial that will include pregnant women. So it will refer to ethics, preclinical, clinical phases, Next. The second pillar of the task force is to develop an enabling environment to support the ethical inclusion of pregnant women. And this will be achieved by engaging with regulators, researchers, product developers, policymakers, and communities to foster collaboration and align priorities. Next. The third pillar of the task force is to enhance WHO internal coordination and collaboration. Next. And the fourth pillar of the task force is to strengthen coordination and collaboration with external partners who share our vision to exchange knowledge and unite efforts in advocating for the needs and concerns of pregnant women. Next. So in conclusion, we have a window of opportunity. Many seeds have already been planted. Now is the time to join forces and move from theory to action. Next. So we believe that maternal health outcomes can be improved through collaborative life course approach. And as Rosalind Franklin said, science and everyday life cannot and should not be separated. So we invite you to join us in making this change. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Martina and Mariana. That was an amazing amount of information in a very short time. So thank you also for keeping to good time. We're now going to go straight into malaria in mothers and babies, which is a huge issue. And Dr. Miriam El Galoul, who's the head of clinical and regulatory science at the Medicines for Malaria Venture, is going to explain how they've approached involving these groups in malaria research. Over to you, Miriam.
Thank you very much, Carrie. And I'd like to start by thanking IFPMA for organizing a webinar on underrepresented populations in research. This is very close to my heart, and it's really a pleasure to be given the opportunity to MIMBA initiative. So MIMBA means pregnancy in Swahili, babies. It's a collective effort to ensure that women at risk of malaria are no longer left behind. Next slide, please. So before I get into the heart of my presentation, I'd like to briefly introduce who we are, in case you're not familiar with MMV. We are a non-for-profit or product development partnership that brings together academic and pharmaceutical partners. And our mission is to reduce the burden of malaria by discovering, developing, and facilitating the delivery of antimalarial drugs. Next. So to achieve that mission, we need solutions that are suitable for all population at risk, and obviously that includes pregnant women. 120 million pregnancies occur in malaria-endemic countries, and in 2023, 12 million were infected in sub-Saharan Africa. So why is it important to treat malaria in pregnancy? Because this disease increases the risk of maternal death, severe anemia, pregnancy loss, neonatal and infant mortality, as well as low birth weight. Next, please. Despite this high burden and dramatic consequences, significant gaps remain to serve their needs, and largely because they are still too often excluded from research. So how can clinicians and women make an informed decision when there is no data available? And how do you deal with drug labels saying things like should not be used unless the benefit outweighs the risk? What does it mean? So at MAV, we've decided to tackle that. Next slide, please. And 5 years ago, we launched the Malaria in Mother and Babies. So the best way, I think, to introduce our strategy is through the compelling story of Diana and her beautiful baby, Elizabeth. So Natra, if you can play the video.
Every woman deserves to live her pregnancy without the fear of getting malaria.
Each year, about 125 to 130 million pregnancies occur in areas where malaria occurs, and the consequences can be disastrous for the mother and for the unborn child. So you can lose the pregnancy, resulting in stillbirth or miscarriage. Or if the pregnancy itself survives, the child's often born smaller than it should be, so with low birth weight, or too early, preterm. And that in turn places the child at risk in the first year of life.
I developed malaria 2 times during the pregnancy. The baby was not playing well. You couldn't feel the baby in the womb. Even the doctors, when they were checking, they could not feel the baby. I thought the baby would pass, so the baby will die in the womb. They proposed that the baby should be removed for the safety of the mother and also the baby. Baby Elizabeth was born with 1050 grams prematurely. She was a premature baby.
Pregnant and lactating women are underserved by currently available curative and preventive therapies, especially in the first trimester of pregnancy.
If she's in her first trimester, which is the most sensitive time when a baby is still being formed, we're quite careful about the types of drugs that we give. If a mom comes with malaria, you want to know that the drug that you're going to give is safe. The options we have are quite few, especially in first trimester, that have been confirmed by the World Health Organization to be safe.
Pregnant and lactating women are generally excluded from research and clinical studies for fear of causing harm. So when a new drug is registered, basically we don't know whether it is safe for them or whether it is efficacious for them. And to address these questions, it can take up to 2 decades of evidence gathering. And we want to change that.
It's important to include women in clinical trials because we need to find drugs and products that are safe for them, that are efficacious for this particular population of women. When we do clinical trials in populations that actually need it, then we are adhering to the principle of justice.
What needs to change is the rate at which evidence is collected. MMV is playing a really crucial role here because they're really at the forefront of taking this forward.
MIMBA stands for Malaria in Mothers and Babies. This initiative aims to develop the best therapeutical response for all pregnant and lactating women. And this will also contribute to the Sustainable Development Goal by reducing maternal and neonatal mortality.
Our MIMBA strategy aims at closing the access gap by increasing the availability of antimalarials of good quality, prioritizing new drugs that could serve everyone from the start, accelerating their development, and finally closing the data gap by generating data for existing antimalarials. Our MIMBA registry is a very successful example.
It's a pregnancy exposure registry to capture safety data of pregnant women that happen to be by chance inadvertently exposed to these antimalarials very early in pregnancy because they didn't know they were pregnant or they didn't report they were pregnant, and so they were treated with drugs that are normally used for adults but are not recommended for pregnant women in the first trimester. MIMBA, for the first time, puts the first trimester treatment of malaria on the map and will expedite this process of finding out whether these newer antimalarials that are coming to the market now are safe to use in the first trimester.
At the end of the MIMBA registry, we will have enough evidence to be able to say we can dare do this.
When a mother is infected with malaria, it affects the entire family because a pregnant woman is carrying a life beside her life. After all that struggling, I can say that today I have peace in my heart. I have a smile. I've come out of it. My baby is alive. I'm also alive. Elizabeth, I really wish a lot of great things in her life.
The malaria community has very ambitious elimination goals, and the only way to meet them is by designing solutions that are suitable for everyone and by working all together towards a more inclusive drug development.
It is possible. But we can only achieve this if Malarian pregnancy becomes a priority in the global health research and access agenda.
In a few words, our MIMBA strategy is based on 4 main pillars. The first one being to increase accessibility of antimalarials that are suitable for pregnant women. The second is to prioritize the development of non-teratogenic molecules. So from the start, we try to identify whether there is a signal or not. And if it is not the case, then we would really prioritize the development of such molecules for the development. The third one is to basically accelerate the development for these populations. And the fourth one is to advocate for more research in pregnant and lactating mothers. So what I will do now is to go through 4 of our innovative and impactful projects. So I won't be able to cover everything we've accomplished so far, but these examples, I think, really highlight the scope and ambition of our work. Next slide, please. So we all know that research in pregnancy is rare, but the lack of evidence in the first trimester is even more. Mention that many women in their first trimester either don't know that they're pregnant or choose not to disclose it. So that means this population effectively extends to all women of childbearing potential with unknown pregnancy stages. So let's put this in perspective with the example of artemether-lumefantrine, the standard of care for malaria treatment. So as you can see on this figure, it took nearly 25 years after its first registration in Gabon in 1998 to be recommended by the WHO for use in the first trimester in 2022. And with the threat of emerging resistance, alternatives are needed. And I think we all agree that we cannot afford to wait for another quarter of century. Next slide, please. So this is why, with our partners, LSTM, KEMRI, IRSS, and WARN, we set up the MIMBA Pregnancy Registry, a unique active registry in Africa. So what do we mean by active registry, and why is it so unique? Because community health workers in Kenya and Burkina Faso, where the study was conducted, went door to door to engage women, obtain consent, and identify pregnancies as early as possible. And this early detection is crucial because without it, we could miss key outcomes such as miscarriage, which is part of the composite primary endpoint of the study. So on this slide, you can see a photo of Winnie and her baby Stacy. So Winnie is one of the 50,000 women who have joined the study since its start in 2020. Among them, 713 were exposed inadvertently to antimalarials during the first trimester. So the recruitment is now complete and we are following up the last babies, and the final results will be published next year, providing, I hope, crucial evidence to shape WHO treatment guidelines and hopefully also inform drug labeling. On the next slide, so we building on the experience of the MIMBA registry, we recognize that dedicated and controlled trials would provide more robust evidence and in a timely manner. So in 2023, we met with global research experts in Kisumu, Kenya, to discuss the ethical, statistical, and clinical considerations for a potential interventional trial in the first trimester. And altogether, we co-created the first ever adaptive platform trial evaluating antimalarials in the first trimester of pregnancy. Next slide, please. So the name of this innovative project is Sapphire, and we are extremely thankful to our donors, EDCTP, UKRI, and Swiss Seri, which made basically our dream come true. So starting this trial by the evaluation of 3 treatment arms in 3 countries, Mali, Burkina, and Kenya. And as funding will come, we are hopeful that we will be able to add more arms and also include DRC and Uganda in the recruitment. So in this case, again, I'd like to flag the importance of social research. Women and communities were involved to better understand the potential facilitators and barriers for their participation. And these findings have been critical in establishing the recruitment strategies, which are different depending on the countries and the region you are. So it's extremely important to have this understanding. So where do we stand with this project? We have obtained ethical clearance in all 3 countries and regulatory approval as well in Mali and Burkina Faso. And I'm extremely happy to share that the screening has started in Mali. So we are all very excited to see the first patient randomized anytime soon. Next slide, please. So the MIMBA registry and the Sapphire projects I've just described are collecting data for antimalarials that are already approved and available on the market. But what about new investigational products? So as the illustration shows, current practice represented in gray creates significant time and evidence gaps. And these gaps mean that pregnant women are often the last to benefit from innovations. So our goal, shown in pink here, is to shift everything to the left. We want to start generating non-clinical PBPK modeling and clinical data much earlier in the drug development. We are aiming to collect preliminary data in parallel to phase 3 once a favorable benefit-risk profile has been established. Next slide, please. So to make this vision a reality and truly challenge the status quo, a supportive regulatory environment is essential. And that already since the beginning of this webinar. Earlier this year, in collaboration with the Concept Foundation, we brought together 10 African regulators for a symposium on advancing inclusion of pregnant and lactating women in clinical trials in Africa. And if you're interested, there is a link to the full report at the bottom of the slide, and we can share that link as well in the chat. So these discussions were incredibly encouraging, and I'm confident that with the promise of the ICH E21 guideline, which Teresa Wang will present in a few minutes, we can make major progress towards a more inclusive and equitable drug development. Next slide, please. So to conclude, I think we can be proud of the progress made, but as you all know, the work is far from over, and it's a complex challenge. So it will take all of us to ensure that pregnant and lactating women are no longer left behind in research. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Miriam, and thanks for the really important work that you're doing. I'm sorry about the video, but you did a brilliant job.
Thank you.
As you already mentioned, the next speaker is Teresa Wang, who is the Clinical Quality and Compliance Management Director at AstraZeneca, but she'll be speaking here on behalf of the IFPMA. And she's going to take further the whole discussion about how to include pregnant and breastfeeding people in clinical trials. So Teresa, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie, and thank you all. I'm also very encouraged just now, I think, by all the speakers' presentation. So now I'm going to share about ICH E21 guideline, which is a new efficacy guideline that was moved to the public consultation stage from May this year. So if we can move to next slide. Yeah, this is a legal notice that this presentation, the copyright belongs to ICH. So if we can move to next one. Yeah, as just now being mentioned, I think ICH guideline, actually, this is an important step move forward to include breastfeeding and pregnant individuals to clinical trial. So actually the work has started from June 2023 that the concept paper was developed, and I was honored to join the expert working group from December 2023. So in the past 2 years, the expert working group has joint effort to move the guideline forward with a very big step to move to step 3 now. So we anticipate the ICH guideline to be finalized and implement the step 4 in the local regional regulatory system by 2028 in the Q1. So if you move to the next slide. And this guideline objective, I think it's important to provide the recommendations for appropriately include and retention of pregnant and breastfeeding individuals into clinical trials, and also to facilitate the generation of robust clinical data that allows for evidence-based decision-making. This is also in line with ICHE 8 guideline, so that we can enable the individuals and their healthcare providers to treat these individuals appropriately based on all this evidence-based and marketed product. If you move to the next slide. The scope of the guideline, I'd like to highlight here that it includes pre-marketing and also post-marketing clinical trial of investigational product to include those populations. And the investigational product, it's the same as we defined in the ICHE 6R3. And if you move to the next slide. I'd like to highlight there are, I think, 3 very important principles in the ICHE 21 guideline. So first of all is, so when we include those populations in clinical trial, not only for those conditions that has high unmet medical needs, more importantly, it should be considered for all the product, while all the individuals of childbearing potential among the anticipated user population should be considered. So this is very important that I think for all the drug developers to consider and to have proactive planning of obtaining the data and the data collection relevant to those population clinical study stage, so that we can all formulate the development strategy from the beginning to include all the relevant information to enable the decision making throughout the development stage. And if you move to the next slide, there are further principles to be considered. First of all is regarding the engagement and the consultation. So it's important to consult with the regulatory authorities as early as possible and throughout the entire drug development stage. And also it's requirement to have early engagement with all the appropriate stakeholders and including our patient. So all the efforts should be made to reduce the burden of the study procedure on pregnant and breastfeeding individuals when they join the clinical studies. So that, for example, the study design, the study visit, and also study visiting frequencies, the procedures, etc., to try to get it in line with, for example, pregnant visit to the hospitals, as well as taking some approaches to ensure the convenience for the breastfeeding individuals when they are in the clinical trial. And also it's important to avoid any undue influence when these individuals joined clinical trials, and assessing the safety in these individuals is complex. So if we move to the next slide, that would include all further information about safety monitoring. So we may all understand that during clinical trial stage, there may be complexity and challenges to collect all the relevant or the whole information regarding the safety signal, especially for some rare or delayed outcome. So it's important to also continue the safety monitoring in the post-marketing period throughout the from pre-authorization until the post-marketing period. So available data and assessment of the product benefit risk profile should be included, and it should be always updated as the latest information in the labeling document. So if you move to the next slide, this is a structure about ICHE 21, as we can see here. So there are several common sections, like the introduction section, which outlines the objective of this important guideline, the scope, and also the background. Besides that, there are general principles and ethical considerations. These are common for all the pregnant and breastfeeding individuals when they join the clinical trial. There are additional considerations, such as for ethical consideration, to include the relevant experts in the ethics review committee, and also the general principle as outlined just now, that not only to consider the high unmet medical needs, but also to consider all the product in the early development stage, especially when there's a potential to treat those potential childbearing individuals. And also in the guidelines, there are 2 specific sections, respectively, to address further instruction on how to include the pregnant and breastfeeding individuals into clinical trial. So that would outline the development strategy, the inclusion of those individuals in clinical trial, the different design stage, the recruitment and retention strategy, the informed consent considerations, and also informed consent process, etc. So those are the important section to provide more detailed instructions on how to develop, design, and also how to ensure to reduce the burden and to maximize the participation of those individuals in clinical trial. And there are also separate sections which include all the appendices, such as labeling considerations and additional outcome to be collected in clinical trials. So if we can move to next slide. So this is a consideration developing the ICHE 21 guideline. So as shared just now, it is in line with the principle in all the other relevant ICH guideline. For example, for ICHE 8, the approach to collect the data from pregnant individuals, it should involve a systematic expansion of data collection across relevant source and the patient population. And it's guided by a data-driven decision to safeguard the study participants. So it's the same principle to include those individuals along with any other populations in clinical trial. So the general principles to conduct the clinical trial and also to perform the informed consent process, it's also in line with ICHE 6R3 principle to recruit and to have adequate informed consent from the pregnant and breastfeeding individuals. There are also other ICH guidelines to be referred to, such as ICHE 2A, ICHE 2F, E6R3, E6R8, that would also apply to include those population in clinical trial. So if we move to the next slide. So in conclusion, ICHE 21 is a new efficacy guideline to provide a globally accepted framework and best practice to enable the inclusion and retention of those population in clinical trials. So it's important to ensure the study conduct would enable us to get adequate safety, efficacy, dosing regimens information in this population, and to address the scientific and high-level regulatory principles so that we would enable these individuals and their healthcare professionals could treat this patient with adequate information. So if we move to the next slide. This is a last slide that I would like to highlight here is that in the ICH website, you would be able to find the full version of the draft guideline, which was sent to public consultation back to May this year. And also there's a presentation developed by the expert working group to have more details about all the different sections, considerations, etc. So please feel free to take a look, and also feel free to raise any comments or suggestions to your regulatory body. And the expert working group will meet and work together in the coming years to furtherly address all those comments and bring those common suggestions back to have this guideline to be finalized, I think ideally in 2028. So thank you very much for your listening and having the opportunity to introduce this important guideline here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Teresa, and thanks to all our speakers. I think Teresa's shown that you can actually influence policy right here, so think about it. There's been a lot of information, so I think our brains are tired. We need a little bit of a break. So we're going to have a 10-minute break, but please do come back afterwards. We've got a great panel with a regulator from Nigeria, with a patient advocate and others. So it'll be worth your while. But let's have a break for 10 minutes and come back soon. Thank you.